great. Okay, so good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here as part of the Curious Minds series. Thanks, Dr. Barr, for extending the invitation. I think last time I was here in this room was for this exact presentation or this exact series last year, and I think it was a C.S. Lewis talk as well. And so I remember that being a very fruitful and enjoyable experience, and so it's really good to be here on the other side of the podium, so to speak. So today I'm going to explore a comparison between two remarkable 20th century Christian thinkers, C.S. Lewis and Thomas Merton. So they don't often compare. You don't often see too many people putting them in the same category together. C.S. Lewis was a British, or really he was more Irish, writer and scholar and a Christian apologist who's best known for works of theology and imaginative fiction. And if you've heard of him here, you might be most familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia, which is a beloved, often described as a Christian fantasy series. And that includes the most famous title, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Lewis is probably known for direct, plain-spoken appeal to the average Christian believer. Now, Thomas Merton was an American Trappist monk, writer, and mystic who, like Lewis, also had a really broad appeal across this Christian spectrum. He's best known for his spiritual biography, The Seven-Story Mountain, and his seminal work on the life of faith, which is called New Seeds of Contemplation, and that's one of the books that you can win today. Although Merton was a committed Roman Catholic, his writings on prayer and contemplation and social justice resonate with people from across faith spectrums, people who are seeking deeper spiritual meaning in their lives. But despite their popularity and the fact that they lived around the same time, we may be surprised to learn that these two prolific Christian authors never met and they never corresponded. And for people like me, who are both students and personal admirers of both Merton and Lewis, the absence of what would have been a very fruitful relationship, I'm sure, is disappointing. And it's perhaps equally as frustrating to see that there has been so little academic writing comparing their works or analyzing their areas of interaction. When I was looking for some kind of research in which somebody included them in the same space, I found one article, and it was relatively short. So the lack of scholarship on both Merton and Lewis, I think, has less to do with the men and their ideas, and probably more to do with the partisan communities that have formed around them. So traditionalists, or sometimes called evangelicals, have canonized Lewis as the patron saint of conservative and common sense Christianity. And they often assume that Thomas Merton was only marginally Christian, and by the mid-1960s, he was getting ready to leave the fold altogether and maybe go join up with the Buddhists. Now, the Merton camp, who often self-identify as ecumenists or progressives, are just as likely, in my experience, to dismiss Lewis as too practical or too rational or even too narrow to suit their needs. Now, it's my contention that neither man really fits this profile that their followers have regrettably carved out for them, but that's a subject for another presentation. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I want to build a small bridge over the chasm that has developed between Merton and Lewis. And specifically, I want to explore one important topic, and that's the nature of the self. And as we shall see, Lewis and Merton wrote in strikingly similar terms on something that they both called the false self, which is the fallen or sinful state of the human soul, and then also the true self, which is the redeemed and renewed self, or the new identity that one receives in Christ. James Finley, who was a fellow monk and student and close friend of Merton, wrote that Merton's whole spirituality, in one way or another, pivots on this question of human identity. And I think that we can say much of the same for C.S. Lewis. And as we shall see, the true and false self sounds like a keynote throughout much of his scholarly and imaginative writings. He shared with Merton comparable ideas about this false self, how it relates to the world, how it relates to others, and how it inevitably dies and reveals the true self. And so as we proceed with a study that compares two Christian men who are often thought of as incomparable, I would like to turn to a well-known line by Ezra Pound. Now is the time for carving. We have one sap and one root, and let there be commerce between us. The earliest mention of this true-false self dichotomy is found in an essay that Lewis published in 1940. It's called Two Ways with the Self, and you can go find it in the God in the Dock anthology today. And it's a short, understated piece in which Lewis tries to reconcile Jesus' command to his disciples to love your enemies as yourself with the same command to hate your life. Lewis concludes that because these two goals seem to be irreconcilable, that there must be two selves operating within each person. The first self is a creation of God, full of love and rejoicing. And the other self, and he says, which is called me, is a narcissistic and inward-looking person. Over time, Lewis would develop this idea in his writings, eventually coming to speak interchangeably of the false self, the natural self, the apparent self, and in contrast with the real self or the true self. So here's a description from Mere Christianity, which is the other book you could win today, which was published 12 years later. The moment you have a self at all, there's the possibility of putting yourself first, wanting to be the center, wanting to be God. In fact, what Satan put into the heads of our remote ancestors was the idea that they could be like gods, could set up on their own as if they had created themselves, be their own masters, invent some sort of happiness for themselves outside of God, apart from God. When Lewis published Mere Christianity, Thomas Merton had been in the monastery for about 4 years. He believed that by turning his back on the materialistic and secular world and retreating into a life of prayer, that this would make him happy. But his first several years as a monk were often years of personal torment. He found that the self-centered and ego-driven young man who was supposed to have been left behind at the monastery doors was still there. So Merton writes in his autobiography, there was this shadow, this double, this writer who had followed me into the cloister. He's still on my track. He rides my shoulders sometimes like the old man of the sea. I cannot lose him. He still wears the name of Thomas Merton. Is it the name of an enemy? He's supposed to be dead. In time, Merton developed what would become his seminal contribution to Christian spirituality. Each of us has a false self that's hard to shake. And here's perhaps the best known passage from Merton's New Seeds of Contemplation. Every one of us is shadowed by an illusory person, a false self. This is the man I want myself to be, but who cannot exist because God does not know anything about him. My false and private self is the one who wants to exist outside of God's will and God's love, outside of reality and outside of life. And such a self cannot help but be an illusion. Lewis and Merton are essentially describing the same idea. The old self that St. Paul describes in his epistle to the Romans. This is the self that's always striving to have things its own way. This is the self that wants to be sovereign, independent, and self-sufficient. This is the self that thinks about itself in terms of accomplishments, power, or prestige. It is, to borrow a phrase from the Catholic priest, Father Richard Rohr, the pride, arrogance, title, costume, role, and degree we take to be ourselves. The false self takes a look at God's creation and decides either consciously or unconsciously that, well, I could have done better. So the false self's ambitious plan to recreate the world in its own image is inevitably doomed to fail. And this isn't just because rebellion against the divine is a bad idea, but more fundamentally because the rebel, the false self, does not truly exist. Merton wrote that my false self is an illusory person. He says, this is the man I want myself to be, but who cannot exist. And similarly, thinking of his own impressive resume, C.S. Lewis said, what I call myself is hardly a person at all. And here I'm reminded of one of Lewis's great books, The Great Divorce. And if you haven't read that one, I would probably grab Mere Christianity and then move on to some of the imaginative fiction. In The Great Divorce, we meet Frank, who is a ghostly resident of Greytown, which is something like a purgatory, if you will. It doesn't fit perfectly into Christian theology, so stretching it to the point of analogy doesn't always work. But these are people who have died and gone on to Greytown. And he spends his days moping about and nursing his hurts. And apparently, whatever trauma he suffered on earth was so great that he has split into, guess what, two personalities. You have the dwarf, which represents his true self. And then you have the tragedian, or the actor, or the poser. Now, Sarah is his substantial earthly wife. And she has been sent to persuade Frank to let go of his pain and join her in heaven. But whenever Frank responds positively to Sarah, the dwarf, in Lewis's words, becomes a little more visible. But when he retreats into his egotism and starts to project and to blame, then he fades away and the actor, or the tragedian, takes center stage. And I think the most telling line comes from Sarah, who, realizing that stubborn Frank is not about to come around, tells him sadly, I cannot love a lie. I cannot love a thing which is not. And it makes sense that empty and unreal people, such as Lewis describes in The Great Divorce, are always seeking to somehow fill their emptiness. Both Merton and Lewis describe the false self as an insatiable materialist on an endless and futile quest for fulfillment. In Mere Christianity, Lewis talks about how nothing a person can obtain, money, luxury, goods, dream vacations, will ultimately satisfy our souls. In his exchange with Wormwood, in another one of Lewis's works, the Screwtape Letters, the elder Screwtape advises his disciple to always promote the concept of ownership. Always reinforce the possessive pronoun. My dog, my servant, my wife, my father, my master, my country, and even my God. By framing things from dogs to the divine as an object in my possession, we may be led to believe that our possessions define us. I'm the man who owns stuff. But in fact, when we allow possessions to tell us who we are, we place them above God who has called us and named us, says Lewis. Now, Merton makes exactly the same point. The false self defines itself in terms of ownership. In his book, The Ascent to Truth, which is his commentary on St. John of the Cross, Merton writes of the false self's ceaseless quest to own stuff. He speaks of earthly desires as junk food for the soul, momentarily energizing, and it's often quite tasty, but ultimately useless. Merton says that when we realize we're unable to rest in any achievement or acquisition, the pursuit itself becomes our only substitute for joy. And I think it's interesting to hover over that word joy, because it's precisely the same word that Lewis describes for ultimate fulfillment. He says, thus we decide to forget our discontent in a ceaseless quest for new satisfaction. And here, too, I'm reminded of Screwtape's admonition to Wormwood to keep people focused on an ever-increasing crave for an ever-diminishing pleasure. I do not mean to accuse either Merton or Lewis of extreme asceticism. Both men had hearty appetites for material things. Both men spoke fondly of beer, for example, which Merton said he enjoyed whenever he could get his hands on some. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the natural world. Lewis said, God likes matter. He made it. But both men will also remind us that when things become the end, rather than the means to the capital E end, then we have a problem. And so speaking of the end, the Creator, the false self is very rarely an atheist. Rather, he can be found sitting in the front pew every Sunday, and perhaps even the loudest voice in the choir. If you've read the Screwtape letters, then you may recall that Screwtape had no problem with church-going or religious iconography, as long as one's image of God remains just that, an image. Screwtape will declare his victory. When the false self works to reverse the cosmic hierarchy and make himself into God, he also tries to make God into his creation. So think about it this way. We all know these people who have God in their pockets. They know what God thinks, how God would act, what God likes, what God dislikes, how God would vote, and of whom God approves and whom God doesn't. And I'm reminded of what the cheeky writer Anne Lamott said. You can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. And this is why Lewis says that to get out of the false self, we have to set aside the little false gods that we've created. But we love those gods because they make us feel big. And here Merton agrees with Lewis almost entirely here. He writes, our idea of God tells us more about ourselves than him. But we substitute our own ideas for God. Lewis says that these ideas must be shattered. It's in Letters to Malcolm. One of his letters to Malcolm, he says, he, that's God, must constantly work as the iconoclast. Every idea of him we form, we must in mercy shatter. Every idea we form about God originates in a flawed, imperfect self, and therefore is going to be a flawed and imperfect image. Merton's clear that one does not encounter the divine as a comprehensible being. We do not encounter God as a what but a who, he says. And although one cannot understand God, the false self, which has hopeless control issues, will break his neck trying. So once a person arrives at a firm definition of God, he's certainly off the mark. And here I think it's appropriate to give a nod to St. Augustine. We're talking about God. So why be surprised if you don't understand it? I mean, if you understand it, it isn't God. To be an iconoclast, as Lewis has it, is to start down the path that leads out of the false self and toward the true self. But the false self isn't going to give up without a fight. And this is why Lewis said he entered the kingdom kicking, struggling, and resentful. And Merton was always struggling with what he called his unconverted self, or the shadow, as he puts it, the residue of the old man who always wants to have his way. It's unpleasant to give up one's illusions. It's painful to acknowledge our selfish and spiteful and competitive self. And it's hard to look in the mirror and say that our accomplishments, power, prestige, and possessions are not actually who we are. And this is why both Lewis and Merton rightfully call this dark period of reckoning a death. Merton writes, "The spiritual life cannot be reached unless we pass through the dread, anguish, trouble, and fear that necessarily accompany the inner crisis of spiritual death." I don't think that there's a better character suited to demonstrate this spiritual death than Orwell, who's the protagonist of Lewis's Till We Have Faces. If you don't know the story, there's a little synopsis. Physically, Orwell is an unattractive person. She even calls herself hideous. Her appearance is a source of deep shame and self-loathing. And so she keeps her face hidden behind a veil, which signifies this inner struggle and her desire to keep herself hidden, and we might say protected from others. The scholar Jason Baxter describes her in befittingly Mertonian language as the one who has lived her life in the midst of external things, keeping herself busy with projects and ambitions so as never to have to face her own vacuous interior. Orwell's journey is one of self-discovery and spiritual awakening. At first, she blames the gods and others for her misery and the loss of her sister. But as the story progresses, she comes to acknowledge her own flaws, and she acknowledges how she helped to engineer her own misery. And so by the end of the novel, Orwell confronts her inner darkness and seeks reconciliation with the divine, achieving a sense of peace and understanding. And here are some of the words that Lewis puts in her mouth. "This thing that comes to you in the darkness, and you're forbidden to see it. Holy darkness, you call it. Everything's dark about the gods." But in reality, this dark night of the soul, as St. John of the Cross puts it, is not really dark. It only seems dark to us. It seems as if God is abandoning us, but He is not. What is leaving and what is falling apart are our cherished images about God and about ourselves. This is what is falling away, leaving us naked and, like Orwell, vulnerable. The Church Fathers described the way to the true self as the via negativa, the negative way. And we get there by subtraction and not addition, by dropping the masks, as Merton puts it, or the veil, as Orwell wore, that we've worn all our lives, and allowing our true personhood to emerge. So who is this person? Who is this true self? Well, to start with, it's a person that's probably not giving much thought to the question. In Mere Christianity, Lewis describes him as humble, but not in the way that we're thinking about humility. He won't be strutting about declaring how humble he is. Rather, he'll be a cheerful and intelligent person who takes a genuine interest in others. Lewis puts it this way: he will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all. And here's Merton. In an age where there's much talk about being yourself, I reserve the right to forget about myself, since in any case there's very little chance of me being anyone else. Now, I often lose people when I get to this part about self-forgetfulness. What's going to become of us if the self dies? Merton's late life interest in Eastern philosophy has led some to suspect that he was using John of the Cross or Julian of Norwich as a Trojan horse to smuggle in a bit of Buddhism into the church. I think he found intersections with Buddhism, but I don't think this is entirely true. Self-forgetfulness does not mean that we cease to be ourselves, or a blowing out as the Buddhists see it. Lewis likens the realization of the true self to the application of salt to food. It enhances the original flavor, making it more itself. And so it is the same with us. While the false self is certainly put on notice, a person is not wholly annihilated by the indwelling of Christ. To the contrary, Christ makes a person's distinctiveness more fully apparent. When we aren't always posing and posturing and worrying about what everybody else thinks, we're free to be who we really are. And this includes our personalities, our quirks, our likes, our idiosyncrasies, and even our vulnerabilities. Lewis said, the more we get what we now call ourselves out of the way and let Him take over, the more truly ourselves we become. There is so much of Him that millions and millions of little Christs, all different, will still be too few to express Him fully. And so, yes, Merton and Lewis would say we all become one body in Christ. And you've probably heard that in church. But it does not mean that everyone's going to be absorbed into a featureless homogeneity or be transformed into a humorless, glassy-eyed Christ like from a Franco Zeffirelli film. These millions of little Christs will all reflect a different aspect of the unified Godhead. Merton had an experience that I think brings this out firsthand. While he was running errands in downtown Louisville one day in 1958, he had what we can only call a mystical experience. Here he's describing that experience in what is probably the most famous passage ever penned by Merton. And if you've ever seen anything out of Merton, maybe on an internet meme or something, it probably has something to do with this 4th and Walnut Epiphany. In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, and that we could not be alien to one another even though we were total strangers. I have the immense joy of being a man, a member of the race in which God Himself became incarnate. And so this passage, which is now displayed on a sign at the corner of 4th and Walnut in Louisville, it's now Muhammad Ali Boulevard, shows us the goal of contemplative life and a glimpse of what it is like to exist as our true selves. And why we are nevertheless united by a love that surpasses all differences and all petty declarations of self. So, Lewis and Merton, well, maybe back up, I don't want to sell it to you yet. Okay. Lewis and Merton never got to enjoy the pleasure of each other's company. But if they had, I'm certain that it would have been just that, a pleasure. I'm sure they would have instantly recognized in one another a genuinely kindred spirit. Lewis in his flannel pants and tweed jacket would have looked at Merton in his monastic tunic and cloak and known that despite their outward appearances and even their religious affiliation, they shared a common identity in the God that they both believed in and who makes all things new. Now, the presentation that I just gave here has been published in the C.S. Lewis Journal It's a German word, Sehnsucht, okay? And it's the only peer-reviewed Lewis journal in North America, I believe. And so if you'd like a download of that, just lift it up, and it'll give me some props with the editor. I don't make anything off of it, but they give me a report, which would be great to have. So if you'd like a little bit more information there, then that would be great. Okay. So, John, Steve. Okay. So we got our questions. Should I?